Yes, just two left. This next one's going to be, I think, really interesting. So welcome back, by the way. Okay, Sans Fish is our next presenter. Now check this out. He's an experienced designer with a deep background in technology. So far, totally normal, just like everybody else. He's currently leading user research for the Orbital Reef Space Station, designing for the experience of traveling to and living in space. That's unusual. Okay, so let's please welcome Sans Fish.
Thanks. And I need a clicker. Thank you so much. Hey, everybody. Thanks for coming. My name's Sans Fish, as I said. I'm going to talk about a few things today, primarily nature, but also how nature manifests in space, I guess you could say, and all of the creative potential that lies therein. So I want to start with a map. This is a map that Neri Oxman made. She's an architect from MIT. She calls it the Krebs cycle of creativity. And it unites art, science, engineering, and design. As you can see, it kind of clusters things together, divides them between perception and production. And I really like this. I don't stick to it as a rule. Obviously, every model is insufficient in some ways. But I really like this. I had a very lucky experience of having her as a professor, and I've carried this with me in my work everywhere I go after that. This really, I think, speaks to an interdisciplinarity. The way that borders are drawn between different disciplines can be really restricting, and usually some of the more interesting stuff is found in the blurry edges of those things. So what I'm going to talk about today is a representation of some of that, and I think it really honors that anti-disciplinary nature. So I was really lucky to be part of this nerdy, scrappy, and very cute group of people. They were the founding members of the MIT Space Exploration Initiative. We believe there were a lot of fascinating things that were being left unexplored in space. So there's a lot of focus on science and engineering, a lot of focus on safety, very understandable. And all of that's laying the groundwork for travel, for exploration, and was very dangerous. So understandably, the first space age was all about that. But what we were thinking and seeing, and we had that map inside of our head, was that there's just so much more that could be explored that wasn't seeing funding, that wasn't getting priority, and some of the budgets that were going up to the International Space Station. So we saw science and engineering, but not so much these other two quadrants. So what I've learned since then is that space is far stranger and more filled with creative opportunities than I would have ever expected, and that there are way more people that are engaged in creativity and sometimes blending across these borders of science and artistic practice. And so I want to share some of the things today that I've learned, and it's a bit of a curatorial work that I've been doing to try and gather some of these people's works, some of my work, and how I think space is just really generative in terms of creativity, whether you're in space or whether you're on the ground. So because of what we were seeing, this kind of absence of art and design in space, we started a class called the 0G class. And the idea was if you submit a project and you get accepted to the class, then at the end of that class, at the end of that semester, you will get to fly on a 0G flight, one of these parabolic flights where the plane flies up at 45 degrees. They kill the engines at the top, and you kind of fall like a baseball if you threw it up. And for about 15 to 20 seconds, you actually get to experience free fall. And so that's what I'm experiencing here. my collaborator, Nicole Houlier, and I decided that for the first flight we were going to make musical instruments because we really wanted to reimagine what a musical instrument would be like when you couldn't have the guitar sitting on your knee securely, or when the counterweights in a piano, for instance, wouldn't pull the keys back up because there's no gravity to do that. And really just started realizing that gravity is a kind of a hidden ingredient in so many things that we just never really need to think about. We had a friend take a synthesizer up at one point because it didn't have any counterweights like a piano, and figured it would just work normally, and the keys did work normally, but as soon as he went to turn the knob, the entire synthesizer turned around instead of the knob turning around. So even something as small as a knob has gravity baked into it, has the weight of the instrument baked into it. And so there's just a whole bunch of assumptions there, and we started to uncover some of those through some of these flights. This experience of this first flight ignited my curiosity and fascination with how many things get really weird up there, and I really just wanted to start exploring as many things as possible related to that. So it kind of became an obsession, and then eventually a career. So started a thing called the astronaut ethnography, which was interviewing astronauts to try and understand what are the weird things that they experience up there, because of course it's such a rarefied environment that, ask the people that have lived there for a couple of weeks and see what they've experienced, which was endlessly fascinating, of course. And started an art practice, starting with these musical instruments that really probes at kind of some of the speculative things, the speculative ways you can explore space, as well as the real things that you can build right now, and everything around that, basically. So today I want to show you some curatorial work that I've been doing to catalog some of those weird and wild ways in which nature is strange, the phenomena is strange, the body is weird, the environment. All of these things are really ripe for creative exploration. So I'll start with space architecture, because everything that happens in space necessarily has to happen inside of space architecture. You just don't exist out there in any way without this. And this is, of course, a shot from 2001, A Space Odyssey, which I love because you can kind of see that it's a model, and you can kind of tell that they probably spray painted some bottles and stacked them next to each other. But the field of space architecture is full of these really strange and fascinating, surprising considerations. So yeah, if you're up in space, everything always happens in an architecture, whether it's a space station, whether it's a moon base, or whether it's a space suit. So sometimes they call those single-person space stations, or single-person spacecraft. Because it has to do everything that a space station does. These things need to provide oxygen. They need to scrub the CO2 that you're breathing out into the atmosphere so that it doesn't saturate and suffocate you, asphyxiate you. It has to provide maneuverability. It has to provide comfort, hopefully, though that's something that's slowly getting better as we go. The astronauts historically have been chosen for their adaptability, and so this degree of comfort or luxury up there really hasn't been a priority because we've selected people that are just kind of okay in really uncomfortable situations. But if we want to democratize space to the degree that we can, then we really need to start focusing on some of those things as well. So that's a big part of space architecture. It's when you're building these things, whether it's a moon base or a space station, you're building a habitat, you're building an entire environment, you're building an atmosphere, you're building a landscape, you're building a room, you're building a view, really. If you're designing the windows, if you're designing where this thing is going to live, how far away from Earth it's going to live, how much of the curvature of the Earth you're going to see, if you can see Earth all at once or not. All of these things are an exercise in experience design, and they're heavily weighted towards engineering, of course, but really you're designing the experience of somebody up there. If you don't scrub enough carbon dioxide out of the air, then people start getting headaches. And if you have too many people in a room and you're having a party, then people start getting headaches because everybody's breathing carbon dioxide out around each other, and you don't have a wind to carry it away up there. You just have to rely on some of the fans and the air currents up there. So again, these are all considerations to make from an experience design perspective. There are a small number of architectures that have been flown so far. They each have unique stories about what it was like and what they prioritized and what they knew at the time, because these things get created over a really long amount of time. Even some of the graphic design in space architecture is really surprising and challenging, because really you could potentially approach things from any orientation, right? 360 degrees around. You could show up completely upside down. These are the interventions that they made for the International Space Station, and they pretty much rely on a 180-degree flip of some of these things. But you can see on the doors, well, it's kind of hard to see, but around the hatches and doors, they'll have them oriented in all of the different ways, or each of the sides of the door. So even something as simple as like, oh, where do we put the labels? How do we design the labels has nuance and complication to it. And of course, these things really need to be designed well, because in an emergency, you need to know exactly what to do. You need to know exactly where to go. In the current space station, the ISS space station at least, there are a lot of alarms, and so you're really relying on the design of the environment to keep everybody safe. And that goes down to the little details here. I was trying to think about how you would deal with displays when you approached a monitor, because just like anything else, you might approach a monitor, and ideally, you don't want to have to adjust your entire body to a display. You want to have the content adjust to how you're approaching it. And so, displays. This was my first prototype of having a display that actually pays attention to how you're approaching it. You can kind of see the limits of the OpenCV library here, because, of course, it was trained on terrestrial pictures of people. They're all aligned with the gravitational vertical, and so they're typically not leaning 30 degrees or negative 30 degrees off of that vertical. And so you start to see some of the assumptions of gravity built into even some of the AI or the machine learning training models that are behind some of these things. There's 16 sunrises and 16 sunsets per day on the International Space Station. This is ridiculously destabilizing, because not just because it's weird and fascinating and you see something that you didn't see before, but because it destabilizes your entire concept of day and night, right? Like what is a day if the sun's constantly rising and setting on you? One of the ways in which they've dealt with this is in the past, when the station was first up there, they would just align with wherever ground control was. So the Russians would align with the ground control at Star City. We would align with Houston for the United States astronauts. And that people would wake up at different times and have different times of day, and everything becomes really malleable in that respect. But what time is it when you're up there and you have no day and no night? At the moment, they just all synchronize with Greenwich Mean Time, which kind of simplifies things. But yeah, these are just some of the ways in which it's a very strange environment up there. So that's the architecture and the location and the view that you have. The human body changes in all kinds of weird ways. And I'm kind of walking up to the media of creativity here, right? So we have architecture that everything happens within. We have the body inside of that architecture experiencing very strange phenomena and changes. And that results in different cultural evolution, results in different material culture. And that is going to be mixed in with a lot of the strangeness of nature up there. The reason I like to show the sunrise is because, of course, nature doesn't actually end at the edge of our atmosphere. I think I've got another picture of that in there. But first, we'll talk a little bit about the human body in space, because there's so many weird things about it. So you get space face. Maybe some of you have heard of this. Because there's no gravity, all of the liquids in our body start to move around because they're not being weighed down. And again, you kind of rediscover gravity in the way that our own bodies are composed. And that is endlessly fascinating to me. Your heart starts to float. Like the muscles around your heart actually are there to hold it against gravity and hold it in position, which is just magic to me. And also magic that we can even exist up there. I think it's pretty incredible that we can leave the planet at all. And in the early days, we didn't really even know that we could. That's why we started with animals. There are a whole bunch of sad stories about that you can read about if you want. But let's see, what else? Your eyes change shape. They don't know why this is happening exactly yet. It's likely something to do with microgravity. But you start to see some warping, and so the way that you see is actually different because your visual cortex is having to contend with this different geometry. And there are a couple of different stories about that, of people thinking they could see better, and then definitely like a decline in the ability to see as we have under gravity. Let's see, so I need to start moving faster. There's a proprioception change, and proprioception is just how you kind of feel things inside of your body. It's like the senses inside of your body. So not smell or sight or anything like that, but how you know you're falling, for instance. There's also social changes that happen up there, so things between bodies. In the musical instrument work, we realize that there can be entirely new body languages associated with performance and creativity up there. So that is a whole area to explore. What does sheet music look like when your instrument and your body are subject to the same exact physics? So socially, it's kind of hard to move around, and sometimes you need your friends' help to get you into a certain position. And so I've been told that they kind of renegotiate touch up there because you might need to like grab somebody's butt and literally push them into the place that they need to be in order to do an experiment or what have you. So there's social evolution happening as a result of all of these things as well. And even sleep is weird. This is a very old video of, it looks like a morgue. It looks kind of terrifying. You can kind of see, I think I can get this to play again, that people have to be tethered to the walls so you don't float off after you fall asleep. So some of the astronauts will tie a pillow to their heads with a strap just to feel like something's pressing against them. You can imagine how unsettling it would be if you were trying to sleep but nothing was really touching you. So they have these strange designed sleeping bags. There's a lot of noise up there because it's essentially like an architecture of machinery, right? It has to continuously regenerate the environment that you're in. And so that's really disruptive to sleep, but there are a lot of things that are really disruptive up there. There's also things that are called psychogravitational disturbances. So they've already done some early experiments that show that your aesthetic preference is actually different in the absence of gravity. So typically, we're all aligned, right? Right now we are aligned with the same gravitational vertical, and we approach art in the same way. We don't approach it like this or from any other angles. And that has had some impacts on how people have crafted art over the world. A lot of paintings have lots of verticals and horizontals. So, and that was one of the details that really kind of cracked my mind open, is that she's like, if our aesthetic preferences are different in the absence of gravity, then how many other things are going to get really weird up there? And how do we make art or anything under those conditions? So that's why I like to think about this, the human mind is kind of untethered up there. The first astronauts on their first spacewalks had to be coaxed back in because they were so overwhelmed by the experience of floating outside and over the Earth. They can be overcome by the sublime, and they would stop talking, and people would be on the comm trying to convince them to come back inside. And, it's a frontier even, we talk about going to Mars and such. I think there's a lot of challenges in between Mars and us that we still haven't solved yet, but we've never even seen Earth disappearing in the rearview mirror. And that's a profound shift. I mean, seeing the picture of the Earth all at once was a profound shift for the last generation. I think that we're going to see this very strange situation where we actually are going away from the Earth and have to contend with that, and we'll see how that goes. And then one last social thing. I really love that they came up with this idea of taking their portrait completely reoriented or oriented around a center point like this. But if you look at the faces up on the top, it's harder to read those faces, right? We're trained, again, because we're all typically aligned in the same way, to read and remember faces in a certain way. And you can kind of get these ones sideways is a little bit weird. The ones upside down are really challenging. And that doesn't really prohibit any communication, but what it does make hard is emotional conversations. So when little facial cues and nuance in conversation are really important, then you really don't want to be upside down. And so, again, the culture is evolving up there. And I think when people think of nature in general, they think about trees and forests, understandably, oceans. But yeah, I really just want to make the point that nature doesn't end at the upper atmosphere. All of the things that are happening out there are still nature, but they're just very weirded, or just we experience them in ways that we've never been able to before. And so I'll go through a couple of different types of media and how they've been used terrestrially and how they become more generative or are new and different in certain ways that I'm really excited to see how people are creative with. So thinking about water, we've all seen the pictures of water being a sphere up there. And even some of the behavior, you recognize Scott Kelly, of course, even the behavior of the water in this strange shape is strange. Like when it hits, it like stops for a second and then returns. And yeah, so the behavior of these things is really strange. I'm really excited to see how people use this as a medium for creativity. Fire is another one that is very strange up there. I'm going through the elements, kind of. So this is Sai Guo Chan, and maybe you've seen this work of his, this ladder, which is just absolutely stunning. And I love his quote that his work is like a dialogue between unseen powers, like alchemy, because that really is what it feels like we're going to experience when we're playing with these new elements in space, just things that we're familiar with, but that behave in entirely different ways. He uses gunpowder to make a lot of his compositions, and so this is one of the ways in which he can reliably use fire and ignition to create these portraits that you see in the back here. But if you look at how fire behaves in space or in microgravity, you can see, of course, on the left is the one that we're familiar with. On the right is how a flame behaves. And so fire is kind of frowned upon at the moment in space, understandably. They don't really love that. But the reason we have this picture is because there have been experiments up there, and just trying to see, in an emergency, how does a flame propagate? Like if we do have a fire, they were trying to understand that. But I think it's incredibly beautiful, and I would love to see what a comforting fireplace on your way to Mars, for instance, would look like. And yeah, it's just these mundane things that we take for granted are just completely transformed. I really like that. This is Azuma Makoto's work. I've always been a big fan of Azuma Makoto, if you've never heard of him. go look his work up. He does incredible things with flowers all the time. And this quote of his really drew me even further towards his work. I felt the law of nature directly and realized once again that there is beauty that cannot be fabricated by humans. So he's looking at some of these generative properties of a lot of different things about flowers. But one of his experiments, one of his pieces, was to float flowers up into the upper atmosphere. And that series is incredible. But when you think about how plants actually grow in space, it's very strange and different. They've been playing around with ways to modify the genes of plants for space because they have a real hard time growing plants for things like you can't pour water into a pot because it just balls up into little spheres and it doesn't actually saturate the water. It'll cling to it and it'll create mold. Mold is an interesting one because it turns out mold grows in 3D up there. When we typically see mold terrestrially, we see it growing against flat surfaces typically. It's being kind of tamped down by gravity. But that becomes really problematic when you're trying to design a room. You don't want a bunch of sharp corners that are going to be hard to clean or that are going to allow mold to kind of grow out of that. But there's a lot of work going on in synthetic biology right now. It's really creative, and so I'm really fascinated to see how we are creative even with living matter up there. And they've found that even a single gene can really help a plant adapt. So I'm very excited to see the future of that. Again, a really common thing that we think we understand everything about that's just completely shifted. Let's see. I'm going to move a little bit faster here, but moon dust is, I always imagined it as just like dust or dirt like you would find on the planet Earth, but it turns out it's razor sharp. And the reason that it's razor sharp, which causes a lot of problems, it gets stuck in mechanisms. There's not as much gravity, and so it will kind of have a static electricity that clings to things, and you can't breathe it in because it's so sharp. The reason that it's so sharp is that there hasn't been wind because there's no atmosphere. And it makes you realize that the reason that our dust and dirt on the planet is not razor sharp because it's been blown around by the wind and worn down for millennia. And so again, this is nature, but not in the way that we know it. There's people doing really beautiful and fascinating work with speculative geology and playing around with what I have to move faster, so I'm not going to sit on this one too much, but just really fascinating reimaginings of what geology might be in the future. Erika Blumenfeld's work is in scanning space rocks, and I just found out that somebody in this room actually was the coder for this. You might know him as Sean Pucknell, who is why we're here. So a very small world, I guess. Erika's soon going to be the first one to be able to 3D scan the Bennu asteroids, the bits that they've collected off of an asteroid. And they're making these 3D models available in very high resolution for anybody to download. So again, there are ways that media is being created directly from space that we can play with and be creative with right now. Let's see. I just wanted to put in a plug for Erika's work because she's fascinated with space, but in a number of different ways, and her artistic practice is related to it as well. So this is her work called Tracing Luminaries. Here's a little bit of the process shots. So these are glass plate negatives that she had taken from the Harvard Library. She laser etched this acrylic here and used a clear medium that she would paint onto a cyanotype that was exposed to starlight. Absolutely beautiful. And then used gold leaf to reveal the image of that. So she's engaging in this very material practice, but with some of the intellectual history that's come from space exploration. It's really beautiful work. You should check it There's culinary evolution going on. The packaging is one thing. You can see the very long spoon because they have these bags and they have to get all the way down to the bottom of them. And so, again, material culture is starting to evolve. And there's a lot of room for exploration here. Somebody who's doing a lot of exploration here is Maggie Koblentz from Toronto. And she's been asking, what is the terroir of Mars going to be, in the same way that the earth that grapes turned into wine are made of. They have a very particular taste associated with them. And so what is that going to be like on Mars? What are all of these different terrestrial places going to result in terms of ways that we think we're familiar with? She actually just launched something in the Arctic called the Satellite Foundation, which is bringing creatives up into the Arctic in order to do that work. So again, there are ways that you can engage in this type of creative work without having to fly to space. She creates a number of different experiments. She was playing around with zero-G bread and creating these doughs. Fermentation, there's experiments going on to expose yeast that would be made into beer to open space, essentially, and let it be impacted by the radiation, let it mutate, and then bring it down and make beer out of that. And that is something that, like, the people that are making that beer don't have to go to space in order to do that. And so the industry's opening up, and the opportunities for creativity are opening up, and that's endlessly exciting to me. So I guess I just want to end with saying that it's important to remember that nature doesn't end at the edges of our planet, and that everything we experience out there is going to be nature, but just not as we know it, just in very strange and weird and surprising and exciting ways that are going to result in creativity that's entirely unique to that environment. And there's a whole world of materials and media waiting for us to create with, whether it's in orbit, whether it's on a different planet or a moon. And I hope this has given you a sense of all of the different ways in which creativity is going to be able to flourish in ways that we never anticipated before. And with that, I'll wrap it up.
Nice. Okay, let's go over here. You can maybe sit on the far seat. I'll sit on the near one here, and we'll do a couple of questions. We've got some interesting ones from the crowd here. Aishwarya, where are you? I saw you earlier. I know you asked this question. I'm not sure where you are right now, but Aishwarya asks, I'm a UX designer. How can I become a designer for space architecture or a UX designer for NASA? What's the path? Maybe you could share your path and then see how duplicatable that is. Duplicatable? I don't know what the word is. Yeah. I mean, it's all kind of new, I guess. But what do you think? Some advice there?
Yeah, one way is to start getting familiar with the documentation that is put out there. So almost all of the documentation for the design of the International Space Station, because it was publicly funded, is just out there. Usually in one or two places. NASA has, it's called the NTRS, I think. It's like a repository system that just holds all of these things, and that's everything from really deep science papers all the way to just a document that tells you exactly how all the labels are designed, what materials they need to be made out of. You saw an example of some of the ways that they need to be oriented. Color is really important, so I would recommend starting to learn.
Oh, that's cool. I didn't realize that was all
details.
out there. I mean, it's worth mentioning, too, that the project you're working on it's privately funded, right? I mean, it's Blue Origin and Sierra Nevada or something like that? Not the beer company.
Sierra Space.
Sierra Space. I was like, wait a minute, they're really branching out. Sierra Space. Okay, and so even though it's privately funded, are they releasing some of this stuff too publicly? Like, is that the plan, at least at some point?
So at the moment, we are part of a NASA competition.
Oh, okay.
Essentially, NASA wants to be able to sunset, it's a nice way to say it, sunset the ISS, crash it into the ocean is the other way to say it. And so they want to continue to do all of the science that they're doing up there. And so they want to take all of the payloads from the ISS and anything that they have queued up and move them into one or a series of other space stations. And so we are one of the competitors for that work. There's about 3 or 4 space stations being designed right now that are funded in part by NASA money because they care about this and they want to be an anchor tenant, essentially.
I see. Okay, so at some point they're going to have to decide, I guess, whether or not they're going to implement some of your team's design ideas. Is that kind of how that works? And then
yeah, a lot of so the team that I work on is architects, industrial designers, and experienced designers all working together, which is kind of rare. So it's, that alone is really exciting.
Yeah.
But yeah, some of that design work will go into the station itself.
Okay.
But it's a commercial space station. We're going to need to sell seats and space on it, and so you'll start to see these things come out because there's no other way to get people to engage in the space station.
That was my next question. Is okay. So the way I've heard this described is it's supposed to be a mixed-use space station, right? So yes, the research that kind of historically has been done on ISS, maybe some of that will continue, but then commerce. I mean, you were even hinting at it here with space beer, right? You can maybe develop. But then tourism is another component of that.
That's right.
So from a UX perspective, and I'm not a UX designer, but that sounds very complicated. It sounds like you've got a lot of people, a lot of use cases, a lot of potentially competing interests. Is that something you have to grapple with right now, or is that something that kind of is going to get worked out later? Like, how concerned are you about all of these multiple use cases that this space station is going to be used for?
Yeah, I think if we do it right, then we will mitigate some of those conflicts, right? You can imagine people operating in different rooms or in different modules. A lot of the conversation around what we might be able to do up there is to move some manufacturing and heavy industries off to orbit, so we don't have that impact on the Earth.
Okay.
You can imagine that being very segmented away from like the hotel
the tourism
concept
part.
Or whatever.
Yeah. Maybe they just put the tourists to work make them move things around. There you go.
We'll see. There's I mean, one of the challenging things is that astronauts are trained for like a decade before they go up there typically.
Yeah.
And so what we call an astronaut and what training you have to go through and how long that takes, how much of a diversion from your everyday life it is going to be very different.
Yeah.
And so I think that's one of the big opportunities for UX designers and experienced designers is to help figure out how we're going to bring people up there without having them
all that training and specialization and all that.
Yeah, and we'll design the station as well as we can in order to avoid a lot of those things.
Yeah.
But there are ways to facilitate that, and I think UX and experienced designers are going to be.
One thing that struck me is you're showing the video of the morgue, people sleeping. Astronauts are trained to there's no privacy whatsoever, right? I mean, on the ISS, I don't think there's any such thing as privacy. Is there a little bit?
A little bit of privacy.
Okay, tell me about that.
Yeah, going with the morgue theme, they really look like coffins. They're like this, more or less the size of your body, with a little bit of extra space and a workstation, things of that nature. But even having an enclosed space is a little bit risky and has some challenges because you need to make sure the air is flowing through there.
Oh.
You can develop CO2 bubbles that end up being, you have to worry about asphyxiation if the fans break or what have you. So private space is a challenge technically in itself.
Yeah.
But of course the goal is, if you're going to have commercial guests, if you're going to have a lot more people working up there.
Yeah.
And just for crew cohesion reasons, you want to be able to go in the other room sometimes.
Right. I mean, if you're thinking in terms of tourism, right? It's how long would these people, if they're tourists, how long might they be up there? Do you know yet, or is that still kind of being worked out?
It's still being worked out. The impact on the body is pretty significant, and so that's going to be one of the limiting factors. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah. Because I mean, if it's just a few days, maybe you can handle not having any privacy. But if you're up there for much longer, some people aren't going to be able to handle that very well. So somebody asked, and this is, I think, a really kind of open-ended question, but are there any new jobs that you can imagine people doing kind of in this environment? I mean, you've hinted at a few of them here at the very end, but are there things that, let's look ahead several years, and this is already built and it's happening. Are there kind of new, new things you might see happening up in the space station?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, new jobs on the space station as well as back
Down
on
here,
Earth, right?
okay.
Because we've got a whole bunch of people managing the very few people that are up on the station.
Oh, right.
So all the interesting stuff doesn't only happen up there. There's a lot of fascinating work and jobs down there. On the space station, I mean, there are going to have to be people that stay up there for longer.
Yeah.
There are going to have to be crew that maintain it. So, I'll rely on the hotel example. I don't know how much the corollaries are going to map between these, but you have to have somebody that knows how to use all of the equipment to keep people safe. You need to have people who are worrying about the hospitality aspects of it, and those are going to be unique and challenging, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I mean, just the health impacts.
Yeah.
There's a long tail of health impacts that I didn't mention because.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
Well, there's bone
they're
density
less
issues
pleasant.
and stuff like that. Yeah, it's a big one.
Yeah.
You're gonna have like a super concierge, somebody who can do,
Yeah.
tell you what to do for fun, but also help you with your CO2 scrubbing.
Yeah. And also have a life up there of their own.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How long are people in the International Space Station, which is, I guess, really what you have to draw on for most of this research? I know some people have been up there for a super long period of time. Is there kind of an average period of time that people go up?
I don't know what the exact average is. I know that the longest, I think, is a Russian cosmonaut that was there for 2 years.
And he's had all sorts of health problems, hasn't he?
There are a lot of health problems when you come back. I think we've learned to mitigate them quite a bit, and NASA's put a lot of effort into that.
Yeah.
And there's even health stabilization processes that they go through before they go up there.
Oh,
whether it's to have a diet that's really consistent or other things of that nature.
You showed 2001, and I thought, how come we don't have the fake gravity solution? Is that are there certain things? Are there certain technological challenges that we have now that might actually be solved before this thing is built, and then you're gonna have to go back to the drawing board on some of these things? Is that a reality that you have to think about?
Hard to predict because they're pretty challenging problems sometimes. I mean, one of the big ones, if you think about going to Mars, is radiation. And your exposure to radiation.
Okay.
So you don't have the benefit of the atmosphere like we do to protect us from that. And close to the Earth, it's relatively safe. But when you start going out to the moon and further to Mars, those are real challenges. So thinking about how do you design the architecture or the interior, literal interior design to contend with those things and also provide comfort as well as health.
It's interesting to see how you've begun to see changes in interior design because everything that I've ever seen on the ISS is just super functional. There's no aesthetic considerations that I can see, at least. But then I've seen some shots of some of the SpaceX interiors, and I'm like, that's actually kind of cool looking. It looks like a Tesla or something, and so that's interesting to see that creeping in. It's that other half of the map that you all are trying to really focus on. And I think that is important, right? It's going to be, you can't, not everybody's an astronaut who's built for this utilitarian mindset. And so do you feel like you're being listened to by the other half of the map? Do they seem to understand the importance of these things? Or do you have to kind of convince them of these things?
A little bit of both, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, if you've been focusing on safety for a really long time, it's kind of hard to start to suggest some of these other things. So understandably, and I kind of count on that, frankly. For us
because
to
you need the
do our
pushback.
work. But I mean, just in terms of design and interior design, there's a thing called sensory monotony that happens up there, where it's always exactly the same temperature. It's there's no breeze. There's no real maybe you get a little bit of heat from the sunrise. But sensory monotony is always the same.
It's like San Diego, basically. It's just, 72 and
same
sunny.
temperature, same noise, right? There's just white noise going on constantly. And then a lot of, one astronaut told me that it was like sleeping at the office. It was just in a lab. It was designed to be a lab, so understandable.
You can never get away from work, basically,
Yeah. And so there was one part of the station that was this weird salmon color. And on the ground, people are like, why would you have chosen that? But when it got up there, that's what the astronauts gravitated to, because it was it interrupted that sensory monotony.
The one thing that wasn't the same. Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, and then that goes for texture, it goes for sound, it goes for all kinds of
all the things we take for granted. Wow.
Yep.
Thank you so much. That is
Yeah.
awesome. Nice round of applause for Sans
Thank you.
here. Okay, by this time you all know the drill. You got about 15 minutes, and then we're gonna come back for Emily Baltz, which is gonna be awesome. That's the last talk of the day, so I know you're all gonna be here. 4:55, okay? See you then.